Have you ever experienced a story or a piece of media that you felt was made for you? It might not be perfect or universally loved. It can even be something that's been critically panned. But to you personally, that piece of media resonates with you in a way that is difficult to put into words. Over the course of our lifetimes, we'll probably experience thousands upon thousands of different stories. Stories that we'll consume in mediums as diverse as theatre, radio, books, graphic novels, television, video games, and cinema. It's through these mediums that we may discover the one story that just clicks with us, one that we can rediscover new things about time and time again as we revisit it. Many factors can play into this personal affinity we have with the media and stories we love. Perhaps a loved one introduced you to it. Perhaps it's media you experience with friends, or maybe the piece of media has a particular story that speaks directly to your own life experiences, allowing you to recontextualize things in a way you probably never thought possible. Some of us may never get that experience from the stories we engage with, others probably only once or twice. For me personally, I can say that Martin Scorsese's 2016 film Silence is one of those stories. When I finally did sit down to watch Silence for the first time, I didn't expect the film to have the level of impact on me that it did. I have always been aware of Scorsese's exploration of the Catholic faith, in movies of his such as Who's That Knocking on My Door, Mean Streets, and The Last Temptation of Christ, which you can argue that Silence is its spiritual sequel. But Silence is a movie that really spoke to me, for reasons I'm about to explain. Like Scorsese, I too had a Catholic upbringing. I've been baptised, had First Holy Communion, I've been confirmed, I was an altar server during my primary school years, attended Mass every week, and I even attended a Catholic comprehensive for secondary school, the kind of school where we used to recite a school prayer before every lesson. It's fair to say that I had a robust Catholic education growing up. But for nearly the past 10 years or so, I've stopped attending Mass. I no longer pray as often as I used to, and I can barely remember when my last confession was. Whenever I'm filling out forms and I'm asked what my religion is, I always tick Roman Catholic or Christianity just out of force of habit. Despite me no longer formally practicing the faith anymore, a part of my identity will still always be tied to the Catholic faith. It's just too ingrained in me for me to ever completely let it go, even though I realised as I grew older that I struggled, and still struggle, to reconcile many of the inconsistencies within the doctrines of the religion and with my own lived experience as an adult. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of certain aspects of the religion that I struggled with personally. This is not that type of video. The last thing I want is a theological war going on in the comment section. What I'm interested in talking about is the question of faith and what that means, because it's when I watched Silence for the first time that I really begin to reconsider what it actually means, and how lapsed Catholics such as myself can learn from it. Firstly, let me break down the plot of the film. Silence is based on Shusaku Endo's 1966 novel of the same name, a novel widely considered to be Endo's magnum opus. The story of both the book and the film follow two Jesuit priests, Sebastião Rodrigues and Francisco Garupe, who embark on a dangerous mission to 17th century Japan to look for their former teacher, Cristobal Ferreira, who is rumoured to have apostatized, that is, renounced his faith, and is now allegedly living as a Japanese man. Both the film and the book are inspired by the real-life events of the horrific religious persecution in Japan during that time period. A lot of the atrocities that occurred throughout the film really did take place under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. So what transpires is a story that explores what it means to have faith in a society that can cruelly and fatally punish you for it. There is one scene that occurs early on in the film, where Rodrigues comments on the faith of the Japanese locals he encounters in Goto village shortly after his arrival to Japan.
I worry they value these poor signs of faith more than faith itself.
I think this line sums up the overarching theme of the film in its exploration of faith. It seeks to differentiate between performative actions and rituals we as humans decide are signs that someone is faithful, and a very spiritual idea of faith itself. Let's say that an act of faith consists of refusing to step on a fumier of Christian iconography, even if refusing to do so will cost you not only your own life, but maybe even the lives of your loved ones. If one did in fact choose to step on the fumier, but still in their heart knew that they loved God, would that be an unfaithful act? The fumier in question is just a man-made instrument, a flawed and oftentimes biased imitation of what the maker believed Jesus or the Virgin Mary looked like. I think this is the case that the film is making, that the things we take for granted and deem as signs of faith are not the same as faith itself. So this begs a question. Merriam-Webster has several definitions of faith, the most pertinent ones being belief and trust in and loyalty to God, belief in the traditional doctrines of a religion, a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. But I find this passage from James chapter 2 verses 14 to 17 to be the most interesting in what it says about faith. It says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, If someone claims to have faith but has no deeds, can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So if faith is defined by one's actions, what are the examples of actions in silence that tell us one has faith? This is a film where persecution for believing in a religion is rampant. So the obvious answer is, like I alluded to before, refusing to renounce one's faith regardless of the personal cost. Martyrs are a huge part of the Christian canon. There are literally hundreds of them, with many individuals even becoming saints after their deaths. Jesus, it can be argued, was the first and greatest martyr, and his followers that came after his ascension follow his example, enduring hardship and suffering the way Jesus did during his passion, while still holding on to their faith and belief in God's divine plan. This is the example that Rodriguez and Garupe follow, and what they impart to the Japanese Christians to follow as well. They, like many other Christians, believe that the hardships that they endure are designed to be a test of their faith. Renouncing it or giving it up, even if it's to save themselves or others, is just simply out of the question. For them, the principal idea of Christianity is to never give up one's faith, even at the cost of one's life. This very belief is even in the Bible. In Matthew chapter 10 verse 33, it says, "But those who reject me publicly, I will reject before my Father in heaven." However, the Bible also says in Matthew 22 verses 36 to 40, "Teacher," he asked, "which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important commandment. The second most important commandment is like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself." The whole law of Moses and the teachings of the prophets depend on these two commandments. This is the spiritual conflict that the film is interested in exploring. In essence, Silence can be viewed as a story that pits these two greatest commandments at odds with one another, exemplified through Rodriguez's internal conflict. The climax of the film centers around Inoue the Inquisitor, who's in charge of persecuting the Christians, and he presents Rodriguez with an ultimatum: to renounce his faith to save his Japanese followers from torture. It's a spiritual catch-22. If he renounces God, he can save his neighbor, the Japanese Christians that are being tortured. But to him, doing so would be the same as breaking the most important commandment. However, if he keeps to the first commandment and allows the Japanese Christians to continue in their suffering, even though he has the power to stop it, he will be breaking the second and not showing love for his neighbor. I want to be clear here. I'm not blaming the horrifying persecution of Japanese Christians on Rodriguez. That would be unfair and ridiculous. In truth, there is little he can do to turn the situation around in Japan and turn it into a place where Christians can practice their faith out in the open. The abject cruelty and inhumanity that the Japanese Christians have to endure is the responsibility of the Tokugawa shogunate and them alone. This fact, however, is not the focus of this video or even the film itself. Scorsese, and by extension Shusaku Endo, are not interested in exploring the socio-political issues of Edo period Japan and how it led to the persecution of Japanese Christians. They are more concerned with the spiritual and how one holds on to their faith in an environment that is so hostile towards it. The Tokugawa shogunate in that regard served merely as a plot device to deeply explore the contradictory question that is at the heart of Rodriguez's internal and spiritual conflict. Can I still be faithful to God if I renounce my faith publicly? At the start of the film, this question would be inconceivable to both Rodriguez and Garupe's understanding of their faith, as I outlined before. Refusing to apostatize is a no-brainer to them because they've been conditioned to see religious persecution as a vehicle to which they can show the strength of their faith, that no matter how gruesome the torture they endure, they will never renounce God, and that in their death, they will become martyrs, the highest honor a follower of Christ can achieve. What Silence does so brilliantly is challenge this assumption to its utmost extreme. When Rodriguez and Garupe first arrive on the island, the villagers they encounter are living in constant fear, retreating underground to avoid further persecution and being wary of their fellow villagers who are not Christians. Historically, these groups of Japanese Christians were called the Kakude Kirishitan, or hidden Christians, and their descendants are alive in Japan today. Rodriguez and Garupe's initial reaction to meeting these hidden Christians is awe at the fact that they continue to hold on to their faith, despite the enormity of the harsh conditions that they find themselves in. They see it as a testament of God's grace that their faith remains so strong in such adversity, and take it upon themselves as a holy mission to nourish that faith and continue offering guidance to the hidden Christians. The scenes that follow this masterfully highlights the disconnect between the reality that the hidden Christians find themselves in and the desperate clinging on to religious acts of devotions that in their present context will do more to bring them further harm and persecution rather than save them. An illustrative example of this occurs shortly after Rodriguez baptizes a baby. Rodriguez makes an interesting remark, saying that the child is safe in God's grace.
The child is safe in the grace of God now, and that is what is important.
Even if that is true spiritually, the child's present material circumstances have not changed. Growing up among the hidden Christians, the child will continue to live in hiding, as the danger of discovery will forever loom nearby. One could even interpret this baptism scene as condemning the child to suffer, even perhaps to death, rather than actually saving them. This spiritual conflict is weaved throughout the narrative seamlessly. Acts of religious devotions that we view as keys to our eternal salvation after death and that we take for granted in countries that accept Christianity can easily be weaponized against us and used as pretext for torture and execution in countries that don't. In this scenario, does that same act of devotion serve as an instrument for salvation or as a harbinger for death and suffering? If the latter is true, would renouncing one's faith to save someone else from certain death really be so sinful if deep in your heart you know you still believe in God? In other words, can we hold on to our faith in silence? It's through both the characters of Rodriguez and Kijichiro that we explore this question, and throughout both of their stories, the film comes to two different conclusions. When we first meet Kijichiro in Macau, he's an alcoholic vagrant who denies that he's a Christian in front of Rodriguez and Garupe.
I am not Christian!
He's presented as a wretch and a coward that isn't meant to inspire much sympathy from the audience. We later learn that his entire family were burned alive for their Christian faith, and that Kijichiro managed to be the sole survivor, for he was the only one who publicly renounced his faith before the shogunate. Throughout the film, Kijichiro is presented in sharp contrast to his fellow Japanese Christians. Time and time again, he apostatizes to save his own life, while other Japanese Christians choose the path of martyrdom, refusing to renounce their faith even when subjected to the most brutal and inhumane methods of torture. But even though Kijichiro publicly renounces his faith again and again, he still follows after Rodriguez and asks him to absolve him of his sins. Even when Kijichiro betrays Rodriguez and gives him up to the Japanese officials, he still follows him after the fact, hopeful that he can be forgiven for his weakness. Many have likened Kijichiro's character as serving the role of Judas to Rodriguez's Jesus, and while I can see the obvious parallels, I tend to come away from the film with a different reading of his character. In this story, I feel that Rodriguez is the one who serves the role of Judas, which I'll touch on more later. So I think Kijichiro, in the context of this story, is meant to represent to the audience the ordinary Christian, the one who, despite their best efforts, continues to sin and to err, recognizes their weakness and shortcomings, but still seeks God's forgiveness and holds on to the faith that God will forgive them for their repeated transgressions. It's telling how Rodriguez responds to Kijichiro's seeking of absolution throughout the course of the film. It's obvious that Rodriguez becomes increasingly unwilling to perform the rite of confession on Kijichiro, and on some level, we as the audience sympathize with him. Through Rodriguez's perspective, we're meant to view Kijichiro as a man unworthy of the Christian faith, who continuously apostatizes just to save his own skin, and selfishly pursues absolution to rid himself of the guilt of his own cowardice. But it's Kijichiro's inherent cowardice that makes him uniquely ready to accept the material circumstances that he finds himself in 17th century Japan. It's never mentioned if he believes in a paradise after death like his fellow Japanese Christians, and he doesn't share the same aspirations of martyrdom that Rodriguez and Garupe share. He's a man who is just afraid to die. And to me, that's sympathetic enough. Regardless of whether or not he does believe in eternal life after death, that doesn't make the prospect of dying any less frightening. It's Kijichiro's fear of death that grounds him in reality and compels him to cling to life, a very human response to the horrors he has suffered. But this makes him a living, breathing contradiction that makes it hard for others to ever fully trust him or sympathize with him, because as he has demonstrated, he would say and do anything to save himself from death and torture. This is an assessment Rodriguez makes when they first meet, questioning if he and Garupe can believe anything he says.
He says he's not, but can you believe anything he says?
Ultimately, Kijichiro represents the type of person Jesus was sent to save. The wretched and the poor, the sinners among us, the ones who may seem unworthy and unsympathetic in the eyes of many, but are still deserving of God's love and forgiveness. Throughout the film, Kijichiro's faith is expressed through his belief that he will be forgiven. He clings on to the sacrament of confession as a way of dealing with his self-perceived weakness, but it's here where Kijichiro's fixation on confession separates his story from Rodriguez. Kijichiro becomes dependent on Rodriguez to validate his faith in a way that seems selfish and almost parasitic, and it's ultimately what dooms him, as towards the end of the film, he is caught with an amulet with Christian imagery and he is never heard from again. While Kijichiro was willing to renounce his faith publicly, he was unwilling to free himself of said external validations. This is a distinctive difference from Rodriguez and his character arc in regard to his faith. I think the title of the film is somewhat misleading, or rather it does something that all good titles of media do in my opinion, in that it can mean something different depending on how you read it. Initially I, and presumably many others, thought the title referred to God's silence to Rodriguez's prayers. During a part of the film where Rodriguez is despairing after the destruction of Goto Village, he comments on the weight of that silence.
The weight of your silence is terrible. I pray, but I'm lost. Or am I just praying to nothing? Nothing. Because you are not there.
He feels lost and full of doubt about his purpose and what he should do. At this point in the film, his idea of faith is to keep his trust in God despite the overwhelming feeling of despair he is feeling at the hopeless situation he now finds himself in. There is no proof that if he stays on his current course, he will find Father Ferreira, but he clings on to his faith that he will, because at this point, it's all he has to give him strength. But upon closer inspection, I come away with a different conclusion. During the climax of the film, Rodriguez does in fact hear God's voice, but whether or not it was a hallucination or a projection on his part is unclear, since the voice of God is played by Kieran Hines, who also plays Father Valignano, a character that appears in the opening of the film. Instead, the silence I think the film wants us to contemplate is Rodriguez's own silence. After he apostatizes, it is said by the Dutch trader Dieter Albrecht that Rodriguez, now renamed Okare Sanemon, never acknowledged the Christian God in the remainder of his days in Japan, not by word or symbol, and that he never prayed, not even when he died. But the final shot of the film, as Rodriguez is given a Buddhist funeral, is an extreme close-up of him clutching the crudely carved crucifix that Mokichi had given him earlier in the film. It was this last image that really impacted me when I first watched Silence. It made me reevaluate everything I thought I knew about what faith meant and the different ways it can be expressed. Rodriguez apostatized at the end of the film, coming to the heart-wrenching realization that the renunciation of his faith would be the only way he could save the Japanese Christians, who had already apostatized by that point, from further suffering. It's this renunciation that separates him as a character from Kijichiro. Whilst Kijichiro apostatized to save his own skin, Rodriguez did it to save others. It's this distinction that ultimately separates the two characters, and where I think the parallels between Rodriguez and Judas become clearer. Judas is widely recognized as the villain within the Christian canon, with his name becoming synonymous with betrayal and treachery. But it's Judas's betrayal, an act of which Jesus had foreseen, that allowed Jesus to fulfill his destiny as the Son of God, to die on a cross so humanity's sins may be absolved. In this context, it's Rodriguez's renunciation of his faith that allows him to save the Japanese Christians from being continuously tortured. His betrayal, so to speak, led to salvation. This is a feeling Scorsese expresses in his introduction of Shusaku Endo's novel, where he writes, "For me, it is a story of one who begins on the path of Christ and who ends replaying the role of Christianity's greatest villain, Judas. He almost literally follows in his footsteps. In so doing, he comes to understand the role of Judas. This is one of the most painful dilemmas in all of Christianity. What was Judas's role? What was expected of him by Christ? What is expected of him by us today? With the discovery of the Gospel of Judas, these questions have become even more pressing. Endo looked at the problem of Judas more directly than any other artist I know. He understood that in order for Christianity to live, to adapt itself to other cultures and historical moments, it needs not just a figure of Christ, but the figure of Judas as well." Judas is a character that Scorsese explores in his 1988 film, The Last Temptation of Christ. The film is a fictional reimagining of the Gospels that humanizes Jesus and shows him struggling to reconcile his destiny to be the Messiah with earthly desires such as marrying a woman and raising children. This film makes the argument that Jesus' inevitable sacrifice could only be achieved through Judas betraying him. The ending scenes of the film highlight how the external validation of Rodriguez's faith, his own sign of faith so to speak, was in effect silenced. He had sought to die as a martyr, steadfast in his belief in Christ, but is now forced to live as an apostate and continuously renounce the faith that he holds so dear to his heart. From the outside looking in, one could understandably conclude that Rodriguez had in fact renounced his faith, but the final shot contradicts this, highlighting that Rodriguez's faith wasn't silenced, but that it endured in silence. So what does silence teach us about faith? This is my takeaway, but I think the film wants us, at least those of us who identify as Christians, to engage with the world around us and use Jesus as an example of how to do that, even if that engagement may contradict with the teachings of the Bible or the doctrine of the church. I think this idea is highlighted by the scene in which Rodriguez sees Jesus in his reflection in the stream. This shot suggests that Jesus and his example of love and self-sacrifice lives in all of us, or at least it can live in all of us if we let it. But doing that against the weight of doctrine and everything we are taught by the man-made institution that is the church can be hard, can feel fundamentally wrong. But what silence teaches us is that if all of our actions are grounded in the love of our neighbour and the world around us as it is, and not how we think it should be, then God will always be with us.
If God had been silent my whole life, to this very day, everything I do, everything I've done,